I got a comment on something that people haven't talked about in a while because it happened back in, I think, 2015, early 2015, was the dust up between Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy and his friends, the Hammonds, and his son Ammon Bundy, and the takeover of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon, and the dispute between those ranchers and the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, and also the dispute between those ranchers and the national media, which characterized the comments of Cliven Bundy as racist because he used outdated expressions like the Negro when saying that black people would be better off as slaves than they are today, and examples of why they're not as well off today as during slavery is an example of how many black children are aborted. That was one of the examples he brought up. And Alan Keyes, who's a Republican black politician who ran against Obama for Illinois Senate seat, he said that Cliven Bundy was correct to criticize the what Keyes called leftist socialism and what it's done to the black community. Now, I don't agree with Alan Keyes that the Democratic Party is socialist, and I don't agree that abortion and socialism represent the exact same values, although I'll acknowledge that most socialists are probably pro-choice. And there have been socially conservative socialists, by the way. Norman Thomas is an example of one. Something I think a lot of liberal people missed about that controversy was that Cliven Bundy's black employee defended his boss's comments and said that it wasn't racist. See, here's the thing. If you say that black people would have been better off as slaves than they are now, it's like obviously that sounds racist at surface value, but you might be trying to imply something deeper, which is that at that time it was 2015. He's trying to say Barack Obama hasn't made life better for black people. That's potentially one of the things that he's trying to imply, and he's trying to imply that things haven't gotten better for black people since slavery because of the Democrat-controlled government. I'm not saying I agree with that exactly, but that's the point that Cliven Bundy was trying to make. And I think he has a point if you look at what happened during that whole controversy. First of all, everyone was so mad at Cliven Bundy for owing the federal government $1 million, and arguably he did. But Harry Reid, who owns a bunch of land in Nevada, at the same time, he owed the government $1 million in taxes as well. And he was one of the chief people criticizing Cliven Bundy. So it was very hypocritical. Another thing is, like, you could argue that the ranchers are on subsidized land, and they are. But if they are, then that carries with it a responsibility to maintain the land. And all that liberal activists seem to remember about Cliven Bundy, besides the so-called racist comments, are the fact that they set some fires to federal property. They set fire to some federal lands. That's all liberals remember about the controversy. They don't remember or care why they set those fires. Obviously, if it was a clear-cut case of arson, they would have said that. But it's like the media didn't need to say that. They just let people believe it, even though it wasn't true. Like they on purpose intentionally omitted. They didn't bother clarifying. They set those fires because it was a controlled burn. There was a wildfire coming to the ranch. I think it was the Bundys. It could be wrong. It could have been the Hammond Ranch. I think it was the Hammond Ranch, actually. It was in Oregon. That's the thing. They don't focus on the details of these things. They're just like, they set a fire to federal property. It's like they were trying to prevent their ranch from being burned down from the approaching wildfire. They're ranchers. They know how to create a controlled burn. They were trying to create a fire that would burn away strategic parts of vegetation so that that fire could meet the other fire so that it would avoid destroying their ranch. That's what they were hoping to accomplish. And they were trying to get permission to light that controlled burn. But I think it took them like 3 days and multiple tries, and they didn't get a response from the Bureau of Land Management. It might not have been 3 days, I'm not sure. But the point is, the BLM didn't respond, and as a result, they're just like, we got to light this fire or our ranch is going to get burned out. We're on government property that's subsidized. I think it's subsidized. They at the very least have recognition from the government that it's their land. In a way, I mean, it's obviously under dispute because the whole thing's about whether a person's allowed to use federal property to let their cattle graze, and you know how many generations the property had been in the family was also an issue at play there. And here's something that very few people know. I actually wrote an article about it 8 years ago and then just forgot about it. These guys were prosecuted as if they had maliciously set the fire, and they were prosecuted under a 1996 anti-terrorism law that was against domestic terrorism that prescribed the death penalty for maliciously setting fire to government property. So, a controlled burn to prevent your ranch from getting burned down by an approaching wildfire when the government refuses to call you back and let you know whether you have permission to light that fire. It's a ridiculous situation for those guys to be in. And it's just a shame that an old man had to die because we didn't want to talk about racial issues in 2014, 2015, 2016. We would rather send bags of edible dicks to anti-federal government activists, a government that's discriminating against black people and Native Americans and has been since it started. And we want to charge these guys with anti-terrorism laws, breaking anti-terrorism laws as if they maliciously set fire to government property, destroyed government property. We want to give them the death penalty for lighting fires. And then we want to shoot an old guy because he knows the people who non-violently took control of occupied a national wildlife refuge. They took control of this building. I think they were armed. I'm not sure. They were probably armed when they took control of it, but they didn't shoot anyone. They didn't point a gun at anyone. They didn't point a gun at any employee or harm any employee while they took this wildlife refuge over, which is a small building. It's not like a big federal government building. This is not the Oklahoma City bombing, where an Oklahoma federal building was bombed, killing 168 people or whatever it was. Like, this is a small wildlife refuge office being occupied over a holiday weekend where no one was harmed in order to occupy the building. And the FBI forced these 4 people to surrender in a standoff that took all night. And it was horrifying to listen to live. I stayed up listening to it, and it was horrifying. I cried. So that's what we're doing instead of talking about racial issues. And to some extent, I think maybe that's why Donald Trump became president, because this whole country refused to discuss racial issues. We'd rather paint some ranchers as racist domestic terrorists who intentionally set fire to government property maliciously and potentially could be prosecuted under laws whose punishment include the death penalty. We're going to give the death penalty to old men who accidentally fall down in the snow because we don't want to talk about how the Democrats are ignoring black people or Native Americans. We're just going to continue to ignore those people, ignore those issues, ignore all criticism of the Democratic Party, which is not that they're in control all the time, but they're the ones who enable the Republicans with their social, conservative, and capitalist agenda. And the Democrats are the ones who are more likely than Republicans to want to grow government and grow the budget overall. Another thing that people ignore is that LaVoy Finicum, the guy who got shot to death, the old man who got shot to death in the snow by, I believe it was the FBI. If it wasn't, it was the Oregon BLM. I'm pretty sure FBI. So they killed him, and their reason was that so that they made the car that had LaVoy Finicum in it, they made it come to a crashing halt in the snow to force the surrender of LaVoy Finicum. They got him out. He was trying to keep his hands up, and he stumbled in the snow because he was an old man and he couldn't keep his footing in heavy snow. It was early in 2015, and they pulled him over and probably almost killed him or injured him just getting the car to crash so they could pull him over and arrest him. And they got him out, and he stumbled. So the FBI pretends that, oh, his arms fell. He couldn't keep his arms up, so we thought he was reaching for a gun when he was moving his arms to keep his balance and stop from falling over in the heavy snow. So they shot him to death because he couldn't keep his arms up the entire time because he was under arrest. So that's what they say, that they thought they had reason to suspect he was reaching for a gun. It's like, why did they kill this man? I think it was Ben Mankiewicz was the guy who was on Jimmy Dore. Can't remember if it was that or Andy something. Some comedian was on Jimmy Dore roasting. I can't remember if it was Cliven Bundy. No, they're roasting LaVoy Finicum after he died. It was like a comedy eulogy for LaVoy Finicum. And they come to the part where it's like, LaVoy Finicum was a beloved adoptive father of 19 children. It's like at that point, don't you stop the comedy eulogy and be like, oh, there's 19 children who will be horrified if they hear this comedy eulogy of the guy who adopted them. See, LaVoy Finicum traveled in Native American circles. He adopted, pretty sure all those kids were Native American. He spent part of his life on a reservation. I'm not saying he was Native American. I don't know if he had any heritage, like genetically. He's basically white, but most of his friends, it seems, or a lot of his friends, were Native Americans. So people don't know this about him. In the basement of that, I think it was the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, was the location where they were mishandling Native American artifacts. And LaVoy Finicum filmed himself in the basement of that wildlife refuge, showing how the government was just letting them sit in dusty boxes. And in some cases, they had on the outside of the building, on the ground, with nothing to protect it, they had little like clay pots and other Native American artifacts. LaVoy Finicum exposed that. There's video that is still on the internet that you can watch of him exposing that the federal government, like it always has, is dishonoring its responsibility to respect Native Americans and their artifacts. And that is a major reason why his friends took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, because they didn't like the federal government and the way it was treating those artifacts, because they thought they should respect the tribes. Now, you could say that LaVoy Finicum had no right to mishandle those artifacts, just like he said the federal government was mishandling them. But does that give you the right to kill a man? They say he was reaching for a gun, but why was he really killed? Because he was a source of inspiration to Native American kids and also people who the media and the government wanted to paint as more racist than they actually were. I'm not saying they're not racist. I'm saying not saying it's not controversial to say that black people are better under slavery than they are now. But like if Alan Keyes agrees with you, Cliven Bundy's black employee agrees with you, if you consider the opinion of Martin Luther King's niece, Alveda King, who is against abortion because she sees how many black babies are aborted. And there was a case in, I think it was Detroit or maybe Philadelphia, where a white woman gave birth to a mixed race baby. Her boyfriend or husband was black, and they didn't really take any efforts to save it. I think it was maybe an early birth, premature baby. And you got to wonder whether that's because of racism. Like Michigan has tons of racists in it. Ted Nugent, for example, there's some Klan chapters there. Like this is the Fourth Reich. There's some pro-life activist exposed a few years ago that you can call up Planned Parenthood and make sure that your donation will go to a black mother who presumably will have a black baby, or at least a half black baby. So Margaret Sanger was pictured with the Ku Klux Klan and said, we don't want it to get out that we want the black race to be exterminated. Like, there are pro-choice people who specifically want non-whites to be aborted because they think that for them progressivism is just about, oh, let's help out non-white people who are disproportionately poor. Let's acknowledge they're disproportionately poor, sometimes for the purposes of government, but then we'll pretend that, oh, some black people are rich, therefore the system works fine. That's how they think. Then they want to give money to non-whites to relieve the burden on mothers who would proliferate their races, which are non-white, Asians, blacks, Hispanic. Democrats are just like, hey, everyone from all the countries, just come into America so we can make fun of you on NBC. So the Democrats might be less racist than the Republicans, but not by much. And that's what Cliven Bundy and the black people who agreed with him, that's what that exposed. And no one wanted to talk about how there were black people and Native Americans, some of whose interests aligned with that of those ranchers, who the media and the government tried to say were so racist. So, what does it say about you? I mean, Cliven Bundy said if black people can't handle his statements, then Martin Luther King's job isn't finished. It's like if you can't handle the fact that there's a black guy working for a guy who said a kind of a thing that's a little racist one time, and he has some friends who burned land intentionally in order to save a ranch because they're on government property, you know, government protected land. They have a responsibility to protect that land and stop it from being burned so that their ranch and their farm doesn't go to waste, so that they can use that land. Because if they don't, no one else will. Like, no one wanted to debate these issues. They just wanted to send edible penises, a bag of dicks, like a candy penises, to the wildlife refuge. It's like, let's help them out by feeding them some dicks. It's like, okay, you're kind of projecting your fear of homosexuals onto conservatives because you want to paint them as homophobes. Like, just go to a therapist. You don't need politics at this point. You just need a therapist. So the Democratic Party doesn't care about black people or Native Americans. And if you really paid attention to the Bundys and the Hammonds and the occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, which thank God no one was shot to death by the FBI during that, 4 people had to give themselves up. Then, we got to talk about how the Democratic Party and the Jackson Jefferson Democratic Party is consistently deny the rights of black slaves and refuse to honor Native American treaties. And during the time when the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge occupiers were giving themselves up to the FBI in an overnight standoff, there was the Sharp family singers saying a spiritual, and someone said that some of the kids in the Sharp family were being hit or abused in some way. I hope they weren't sexually abused or severely abused, but you got to ask at some point, is it okay to hit your kid if the result is that they obey conservative parenting and stay away from the Democrats and the teachers and politicians and lawyers who are trying to molest your kid and groom them and chop their breasts off before they're 18? Like, I would rather that no child get hit, but maybe it's worth it to hit your kid once so that they don't turn into a child molesting Democrat public school teacher. Just a thought. So maybe if we had had this discussion 7 years ago, in 2015, we wouldn't have to murder LaVoy Finicum and roast his death in front of his adopted children. Will we ignore black people and Native Americans and just continue to exterminate them and subject them to sterilization and abortion, which I support abortion, but not when it's used for a racist purpose. Like we shouldn't pressure people through poverty and like lead people to think that the government's going to come in and make your employer give you $15 an hour, just for example, and promise you welfare benefits and tax refunds that you're not going to get, or they deceive you about how much money the tax refund's going to be, as it was with Joe Biden in late 2020. So we're just fooling people. Native Americans and blacks and Democrats are just counting on their vote because they think all minorities are going to stick together. And they don't, because the Democratic Party and the corporatism and the statism it's involved in are just co-opting their identities. And every new fad in society, every new social fad, and every new product, and every new thing that a person can get into just becomes a corporatized, marketized thing that gets marketed to people as their new identity. And we don't have individual expression anymore. We just have people buying things in order to show off to other people. Sorry to sound like Fight Club, but we don't have a true economy or a true society anymore. We're just buying things to impress people. And I don't think our society is, in many ways, any better than it was during slavery. Like during slavery, there were people who valued freedom. Are there people who value freedom today? I mean, I'm one of them. I think there are more. The abolitionists, the radical Republicans, the people who founded the Republican Party. Lincoln wrote to Karl Marx. Like, there is there are variants of republicanism that are based in communism and populism. It's called the social republic. Now, some social republics turn into fascism, like the Italian social republic. But some social republics turn into, the French, the Paris Commune experiment, the USSR, Soviet republics, council republics. There's ways to have republicanism that isn't conservative or necessarily capitalist or for profit or statist. It's to have local state governments where the states and the people run most of the issues and solve most of the problems. The national government's role is severely limited. And you have a government based on law, not based on majority rule or mob rule. We don't need majority rule. We need consent of the governed. We need individual free choice of who will govern us and how. If people want to have a Republican form of government, they should be able to have that regardless of where they live and without moving. If people want a democratic form of government, same thing, or an anarchistic government. Or if you want a statist or fascist government, you can do that, but you have to obey orders, closely, and you can't force that decision on anyone else or pressure them remotely in any way, because you can't have legitimized violence in any way upon people who don't believe in it. Like, if you're going to give yourself over to the state, like say you're going to join the military, you're going to literally let the military gas you because you're like, this is the kind of training I need in order to survive potential future gas attacks when we're potentially in a war that's actually legitimate where we're attacked first. Like, let's say you believe in that, like you're join the military because you think there's going to be a real war that's just. Like, okay, but you definitely are not allowed to make me do that. Like, I think we should abolish the draft. We should stop arguing about who can be required to join, like men, women, transgender, like what age. Like, stop debating it. I want a voluntary society with a government based on consent of the governed, where government only protects people's bodies and their freedom from fraud and slavery and involuntary servitude, and our right to sue regardless of government's ability to try to stop us. And that's something we're not valuing. We're not valuing liberty anymore. And black people don't really have their freedom of speech. They don't have the right to control their own bodies in a health aspect, as we're seeing lately with the vaccines. They're just pressured and coerced. You see, you can't make a free decision under duress. A contract that's made under duress or when you're drunk is not valid. And like, you can't consent when you're drinking or on drugs. Like, the black vote is being taken for granted by the Democrats to such an extent that everyone, and I just called it the black vote. There is no the black vote. Democrats assume there's the black vote, and they hope and think that all black people are going to vote for Democrats. See, I'm racist because I said the word blacks instead of African American one time. That's what Cliven Bundy got, you know, that's what he got criticized for saying the blacks would have been better off as slaves. I don't know if he said would have been or haven't. He is implying that things haven't improved since slavery. Like I'm saying, we don't value freedom anymore. There used to be people like Lysander Spooner, Frederick Douglass writing during slavery and the Civil War about how freedom's great and we need it. And we need abolition of slavery. And we need full abolition of slavery, including abolition of involuntary servitude, which means government can't take your property, and any business assisted by the government can't take your property. Any entity assisted by the government shouldn't be able to take your property, resources, your land, your house, anything you build yourself. Now, maybe there's a case of having your land taken away if you abuse it, but that's a different issue. And of course, there's a question of whether the government should have a right to respect or responsibility to respect your land ownership, or whether you should have to do something to homestead that land and make it livable first. But clearly in the West, there's a lot of land. And if you talk to a rancher, they understand that the federal government should be paying people to move out there and to build farms and to build houses and to make that place livable because there's 80% of the country, 80% of the American population lives to the east of the Mississippi River. It's really crowded in the eastern half of the country. There's a lot of land in the west. Now, a lot of it's not arable and it's dry and it's rocky, but we can bring water in. There's ways to make better use of water. There's ways to filter water cheaply, and there's potentially we could have massive earthworks to bring water from Canada into the western part of the United States and make more of it able to be farmed. That's called NAWAPA, NAWAPA. It'd be very expensive, but the point is there are ways to make it easier to live in the West. And one way is by having the federal government cooperate with ranchers, but they have to listen to ranchers about what they need in order to make that land workable. It's like my cattle need to go here. We need to light a fire. We're going to do this. We don't need your permission. We're not going to wait for you to call us back to give us permission to light a fire, a controlled burn that will meet a wildfire and stop it from destroying the ranch. We have to keep this ranch operable. So the BLM should listen to the people, listen to the ranchers. They shouldn't give them too many privileges or favors. Obviously, there's a lot of us who want to be out there farming too, but we need some education, some skills, some tools in order to do that. And the federal government, also the Cliven Bundy thing, it brings up an important issue. The federal government owns too much land. It's something that libertarians and conservatives, Republicans agree on. Because it says right in the Constitution, the federal government's only supposed to have monopoly or exclusive jurisdiction over the area that is the District of Columbia. And they've massively extended it over all railroads and interstate highways and all overseas possessions that are part of American imperialism. And we're not really allowed to do that. We got to keep it within the 50 states, maybe even the 48. But the federal government is not supposed to have exclusive jurisdiction in any land outside of the District of Columbia. Now, you could argue that, okay, the government's just managing the land and the ranchers are the ones who actually own it. It's like, well, why do they have to pay taxes on something that they own? If Cliven Bundy owes the federal government $1 million, I don't know if it's taxes or just unpaid grazing fees, but why does he owe that money? And why do they have to kill some guy, LaVoy Finicum, who's not even closely related to the guy? He's not biologically related. He just knows him. He knows a guy who said something racist, so he has to get shot to death in the snow. And comedians make fun of him in front of his children on YouTube. Like, can you show us more that you hate us? Like, not people on the right. I'm talking about people who love freedom. Cliven Bundy's son, Ammon Bundy, he spoke in favor of the Black Lives Matter movement. The Bundys don't hate black people. They feel sorry for black people who are getting mistreated by Democratic administrations and governments, and they want to give them jobs, and they want to respect their right to protest in the street against whoever the hell they want. Maybe it's the Democrats, maybe it's Republicans, maybe it's both. I don't think Ammon Bundy cares. I think he just cares about freedom of speech and having a farm that the federal government doesn't tax too much and doesn't police his speech or the speech of his father or his father's employees. That's what I think.